Good
Good
morning.
morning and welcome to the 5th day of our 21-day online certificate on human rights. It's going to be a tough day today for me with 4 veteran speakers and this nation's best activists in their respective fields. Watch out, 3 of them are the strongest women of this country. A very difficult day for me as a moderator as well, unless all of you cooperate. Kindly oblige. We are giving them each 30 minutes to speak, and I'm sure they are deeply angry with me for that. But they can do it. They can do it in 15 minutes. These people do it before the UN in 5 minutes, carrying the whole world behind them. Please do make sure at the end of each presentation, we restrict ourselves to major clarifications so that at least we can have a few clarifications made. Their bios have already been circulated to you. They do not give usually such detailed bios anywhere. I have bulldozed them to do this with my affection and respect for them. Read it because you can make them useful in your respective institutions. From today, we will have 1 story per day per session. Here it is, today's story. While some forces of communal hatred keep spewing venom to create a religious divide in the hearts and minds of people, some others, with nothing but only love for their fellow humans, set heartening examples of humanity and communal harmony. Members of the Muslim community in Sevri, Mumbai, helped in performing the last rites of their 72-year-old Hindu neighbor, Pandurang Ubel, after the deceased's relatives could not reach for his funeral due to lockdown. Ubel was paralyzed since the last few months, died at his residence. He had been staying in the Muslim-dominated locality along with his wife and son for the past few decades. Members of the Muslim community helped in performing the last rites. After his death, his relatives staying in suburban areas in adjoining Navi Mumbai and in neighboring Raigad district could not come over to his place in the wake of the coronavirus-induced lockdown. As Ubel's wife and son were unable to make all arrangements for the funeral, they informed their neighbors, who came forward to help and even prepared their beer. This, friends, is our India. Over to today's sessions. The first session of the morning on women's rights. We have Dr. Ruth Manorama with us, a grassroots fighting woman social worker who makes it in her slums and in the UN bodies. Over to you, Ruth. Warm welcome from all of us here. Almost 180 to 190 people will be listening to you. Over to you.
Thank you, Henry, for that introduction. I'm so glad that I'm here, pulled out from the streets to come and take the class or a dialogue with all of you this morning on women's rights as human rights. I was talking in the year 2007 to a group of students from a government college. Then I said to them, women's rights as human rights. They were all clapping, and then they said, they are hearing for the first time in their life, somebody told them that women have rights and these are human rights. I was so glad. Young women they are. They are about 100, maybe about 200 PUC students in a government college. So they were so excited. So even for me to proclaim women's rights as human rights is really kind of, talking to the entire humanity in the world. So one of my great admirer and a big leader of the world, like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, he said, I measure the progress of community by the degree of progress which women have achieved. This is Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's quote. If you really look at that statement, how, illuminating this, when women move forward, and that the whole world move forward, societies forward, community move forward. And Dr. Ambedkar, being one of the human rights defenders in the world and in India, and he had said that, I think it has got a lot of meaning. I thought that I would brief you the origin of women's rights consciousness at the global level itself. Say, human rights are those rights that every human being possesses and is entitled to enjoy simply by virtue of being human. I mean, what a privilege. You are human, therefore, human rights applies to you. You have an entitlement to that. This is what human rights says. The fundamental human rights are to be universally protected. It does not spell out women specifically, but emphasizing on equal rights for all. Even in our own constitution, Indian constitution, equality is one of the fundamental norms where we could exercise our rights. In fact, feminists from all over the world, regions contributed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Like the non-Western female delegates, such, their names are like, Hansa Mehta from India and Begum Sashista from Pakistan, had particularly strong influence on the declaration. They showed that equality of the sexes was not negotiable. In fact, Ansa had said that, from India said, and it was a very significant statement, that by replacing the phrase, all men are born free and equal, to all human beings are born free and equal, which includes women. Begum Saista, she's from Pakistan, pushed for an article and language in the UDHR that emphasized, freedom, freedom, equality, and choice. For example, she championed the inclusion of Article 16 on equal rights in marriage. So I think this is the contribution of women. These two women went from, our regions to the UDHR, conference when the declaration was made. Protection of human rights, I believe, and it has been proclaimed that it's a responsibility of the state. It is not the responsibility of ordinary citizens to protect human rights. So this is very important, that it's a responsibility of the state, and regardless of sex, race, color, language, national origin, age, class, or religious or political beliefs. And which says really that, we always talk about in the human rights circle, state obligations, especially in CEDAW, women started uttering. State obligation is one of the principles of, the CEDAW Convention.
Today is 15th.
The dynamism of human rights is potentially a powerful tool for promoting social justice and the dignity of all people. Like, to lead social justice movement today, you need to have the political, tool that is human rights. This is why today that people are afraid of the word called human rights. And, people who defend human rights defenders, like, are hated very much in the world as well as in India. Anyway, human rights acquires new meaning and dimension at different points in history as oppressed groups demand recognition of their rights and new conditions given rise to their protection. Um, First, when the human rights talked about, we always talk about two sets of generation of rights. The first generation is the civil and political rights, then the socio-economic rights. It always looked as a priority and it was very important. But I think that when women entered into the floor of talking about human rights, they started demanding that it has to be declared that women's rights as human rights. That is why we say women are equally entitled to enjoy the rights, and therefore human rights for women, including the girl child, are inalienable, integral and indivisible part of universal human rights. There is no first generation, second generation. It is inalienable right, integral and indivisible part. So therefore, all forms of discrimination on grounds of gender is violative of fundamental freedoms and human rights. You know the violations, gender-based violences that the women face. I don't need to explain. Everybody knows about it. From torture, cruelty, burning them, discriminating them in education, in employment, in labor. You see a wider discrimination exists for women, and therefore their rights are also violated. I wanted to say there has been a debate and struggles in the global women's movement and development on the issue of women's rights as human rights. In 1993, there was a conference called the Vienna Conference on Human Rights. The women really, marched towards that conference in Vienna and told nothing but, we want our rights. We face very distinct disadvantage in life. Our experience is quite different from male, and circumstances of women are quite different. At home, at work, on the streets, and in society and community, our experiences are quite depressing, very different. Because of the discrimination, we face disadvantages. So there has been a considerable debate in Vienna. Several thousands of people participated. Women also participated in large number. And then we had, signature campaign, number one. The whole world, the women have, brought the signatures. Secondly, we also had a very big, human rights tribunal over there to say how women's, rights are so important and how women's experiences are different. I think it was mind-boggling that the women really struggled to establish, the entire concept of women's rights as human rights. And I also want to tell you that there were key historical milestones. We did not get to this, concept, women's rights and human rights, these pronouncements very easily. In 1979, the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. I hope that people know about it. It's very interesting. And the government's, reports to the CEDAW committee every fourth year. And the women's movement are, presenting to them the alternate report. The group that I belong, the National Alliance of Women, coordinates the effort in the entire country, to present the status of women to this committee. And CEDAW is the most important human rights treaties for women. The states that ratified the convention legally obliged, first, to eliminate all forms of discrimination. Secondly, they should ensure women's full development and advancements in order that they can exercise and enjoy their human rights. We have already submitted 3, parallel alternate reports to the CEDAW committee. The kind of recommendations that they've given to our governments, it's very mind-boggling. And like, the women's movement is also following these recommendations that how governments could integrate into their policies and programs so that women can really enjoy these rights. The Vienna Conference came in 1993 that reaffirmed human rights are the first birthright of all human beings, and women are equally entitled to enjoy their rights. So these rights have not come just like that. It's not by, Dr. Ambedkar again says, your rights you cannot, get it by begging, by struggles only you can attain. I think the whole women's movement, for us, it was a great, success, and, we got this, statement that the integration of women's human right must be there. Then we had International Conference on Population Development, highlighted women's reproductive rights, health rights in national and global developments. Then the Fourth World Conference of Women in 1995 is a center stage, the phrase for the first time, women's rights are human rights. Though we started saying that from 1993 onwards, Hillary Clinton came into the, women's conference, and in her speech, she focused, women's rights are human rights. And then she said gender mainstreaming of human rights in policies and programs are necessary. I think Fourth World Conference is really a conference where 50,000, women from the world participated. It was a movement of building, and exercising of experiences that took place so solidly. Women from all parts of the world advocating for our rights spoke with one voice, having learned from their advocacy in working to get global affirmation at Vienna and Cairo that women's rights are human rights. This coming together was facilitated by many regional and international gatherings of women. As a testament coming together of women, locally, nationally, regionally, and internationally, advocating for the perspective of women into final conference document, that is the Beijing Conference. So I talked about the Fourth World Conference on Women in 1995, which marks the culmination. Even the document that we say is a document of talking about human rights for women. It really marks the culmination of historical process leading to the understanding of human rights of women. Women from various walks of life, ordinary women, grassroots women, participated in this conference and articulated together and spoke in one voice and advocated for women's cause. Then the 1993 I talked about, 94 Cairo, then the World Social Summit in 1995. So these are all, different timelines in talking about women's human rights. I was thinking just to say why women's human rights are necessary for us to talk about this in our daily life, in our public life, in our political life, in the institutional work. Because we need to inform women that they have human rights and entitled to enjoy them. And training course like this, for 3 weeks time, is really to inform women and men that they have human rights and are entitled to enjoy them. All over the country, all over the world, we have exposed people. We have exposed people and informed people what are human rights, what human rights could do to people. So we have built up capacity building training programs all over the world. Like, human rights really marched to all over the world, and from top to bottom, bottom to up, yeah? So this kind of training have really helped, women. And while we use the human rights framework for women's rights, it created really a space, the possibility of different account of women's lives. When I say different accounts of women's lives means the Dalit women can talk, the indigenous women can talk, the labor could talk. So I think this was very important to that. The human rights framework through women's human rights gave, to the global movement an account of women's lives can be developed. What is useful about this framework, women's human rights? What women's human rights as human rights is? It provides women with the principles by which to develop alternative visions of their life. You don't need to suffer and die discriminated, abused, and tortured. You can develop an alternative vision of their lives. Like we have used to see very much in this. Every fourth year, when we bring the status, we bring new issues. In the first, report we brought the issues related to domestic violence, violence related to Dalit women because of their class, gender. Like, they come from a caste where we thought that, it is the abuser's prerogative right to use people and, to suppress them. The Dalit women who are brought to these issues. Women in conflict situation, they said our sufferings are quite different. They state, majority, in major times, they become violators of our rights. Our children are abused, we are abused. So I think that women's human rights really inform women and to the world that we have human rights. Secondly, that we also use this to expose and combat violations that are based on sex and gender. What is important is that, when we use this framework, we expose in order to combat this situation. And we report to people, report to the country, report to the UN, which gives us really a strength. And, human rights could be also used, women's human rights framework can be used to talk about intersectionality. For instance, I told you already, the Dalit women thrice discriminated on the basis of caste, class and gender. It's not only gender per se. Black women are discriminated on the basis of race and gender. So it gives a little, women's human rights gives you a different kind of jurisprudence in order to explain the situation. And I also think the women's rights, human rights, framework is very useful to develop alternative vision for women, for their lives, and collectively work for change. We are not women's rights activists are not talking, women's rights as human rights. It's not a very fashionable concept, but it is a very important concept that we really utilize this. So I really want to say that women also get a political leverage and a tenable point for change through using this framework. And finally, the idea of women's human right enable women to define and articulate the specificity of the experience in their lives, and at the same time, it provides vocabulary for women to share their experiences and other women around the world and work collectively for change. And we have brought quite a number of issues onto the table and discussed this and wanted, justice has to be done to women. So maybe it's time that I need to conclude. And I wanted to say, I am not free while any woman is unfree. I am not free until, I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. This is from Audre Lorde, African-American feminist and civil rights activist. So women's rights as human rights is a comprehensive rights. We have not achieved everything what we want. It's a struggle. It's an ongoing struggle that we are demanding that the human rights community must work along with women. Women need to work along with the human rights activists in bringing about this, change. Thank you.
Thank you. Ruth, now you will get the questions or the clarifications that have come out on chat. They will be asked to you. We hope you will be able to ask, at least respond to 3 or 4.
Okay.
Yeah. So some of the relevant questions which have come here. One participant writes, okay, I'll wait for you to have a pen.
It's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. You mentioned about the signature campaign during Vienna and other instances. One person asked whether the signature campaigns are really worthy. We also signed several signature campaigns. Ultimately, what is the measure that is taken, we really don't know. Something about more with regard to signature campaign undertaken, you can share. This is what the speaker is asking.
Mm-hmm.
Then a person is asking with regard to reproductive rights.
Yeah.
So if you can share more with regard to the reproductive rights of women.
Mm-hmm.
And a very general question, but then coming from what you spoke, what are the biggest obstacles that have hindered Indian women to realize their rights? And one last question just came, asking a bit more with regard to the Nairobi summit.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Over to you, Ruth.
Yes. The signature campaign that I mentioned was a very effective one because it came from all over the world, these signatures. And we use this as a tool to say that, in this conference that not only few of us are there, but all over the world, people have signed this document and, we have brought, yeah. So signature campaign from various parts of the world came, and then it was utilized in order to present our views. So it's not one woman or two women talking. It is groups of women, hundreds of women, thousands of women are talking. So it was very useful. How do we use the signature campaign? In order to articulate our rights is very important. So there were several, it's not one activity. There were several activities. People not only conducted, we have not conducted in Vienna only one conference. We have conducted, a major tribunal over there, but also a smaller, huge, number of tribunals all over the world. So in that instance, really, signature campaign have really helped, yeah. And how you use that, politically as an tool to really push your issues are very important. I believe that signature campaigns are very important. It is not that you do it very in an ad hoc manner, but that was used for a purpose, and that you really caught the imagination of the leaders of the world at that time. And then he also talked about the Nairobi summit. In fact, many other summit I was present. In Nairobi summit, that was women started talking about their positions, their status, how the whole world has to really give voices. In a sense, in Nairobi conference, the voices, the forward-looking strategies, where, a part of, this Nairobi conference, and then people have really brought the issues, centrality into the discussion, in a women's conference with a perspective of human rights. I think that is a contribution I can think of, the Nairobi conference contribution. You've also asked a question, how do the governments, what is the impediments? The impediments for us is really first of all, the impediment is that the power relationships itself, that men are above, women are at low, So we are not equal. Therefore, the power relations operates in a way that it silences women. It's, you know, it's a suppression. Uh, it subjugates women. So the power relationship in our society is one of the greatest impediment. That is what we call, you know, patriarchy, the male dominated, you know, rule over women's lives, male dominated, male principles, men's ideas, all that, you know, is part of the patriarchal thinking. So I think that first of all the impediment comes from the patriarchal societies that we live in. The second one is the government itself. However, they can come to all these conferences, all these, then, you know, our governments will say, oh, yeah, like, you know, all these rights are in our constitution. We don't need to follow. And like, why you are talking about human rights? I think the governments must, you know, take human rights as a very important, you know, aspect of their governance. I mean, when you say all the rights for human beings are given, it's an entitlement. It's an entitlement has to be state obligation. So the states must, you know, really not become a violator, but really promoting, protecting the rights of human beings, protecting the rights of women. It is very important. So I think that, you know, the question that, you know, we were asked this, the impediments are the patriarchal societies. Secondly, is the prejudices and norms that were traditions in our society, you know, cultural submissions, cultural subjugation in our society. Second is the non-performance of government itself. I think the government must move forward and, you know, protect, you know, the rights of people. And then you asked about women's, you know, rights, women's, you know, reproductive rights. Like, you know, women reproductive rights in the conference of, you know, population, which came in very, very strongly because, like, first of all, women have said that, you know, we need to have an comprehensive health care, you know, from the childhood to the, you know, to when we become older. It's a comprehensive health care we need. Don't look at only as machines to produce children. We are much more than that. The choice of having babies, how many babies that we want, how many children that we want, the women need to, you know, to decide. The choices and freedom for women was, you know, was articulated in the conference. Therefore, restriction of children, you know, forcing us to have many children, forcing us not to have children, all that should be in the premises of, you know, the women themselves. So women's reproductive human rights touched upon, you know, the adolescents, girls' rights, as well as the women's rights, that we are not child producing machines. We are not physical object, but objects that, you know, we are subjects to determine our future, determine our reproductive rights. This is where that, you know, women talked about the rape, you know, the rape and abuses that occur for women. I think this came in a very large manner in that conference. I was there in that conference, and how, you know, people were neglected in treatment. I remember in that conference, I talked about Dalit women, how they were being treated, and, you know, were negated, you know, their rights by the hospitals, primary health centers. We said that, you know, women's human rights is also inclusive of reproductive rights. A comprehensive health need to be given to people. Yeah, I think I covered most of the points.
Yes. Just one more question which has just arrived, since we have time. A participant would like to know the women's movement's advocacy with regard to marital rapes. of what has been the development with regard to marital rapes, and any specific legislation is covered into. And this was a question which came yesterday also. So and we asked them to hold on to it till we can ask it today.
Okay, I think that marital rape, while we talked about rape in general, we also said that, it really follows the right related to reproductive rights. We have said that, women's bodies cannot be used by anyone at their advantage, Women need to have consent, even if you are married woman, yeah? You need to have a consent from her almost every day, yeah? And people cannot gulf this. They're saying that you are married in order to have sex, in order to have enjoyment in life. But there are abuses. There were abuses in sexual life for women, especially women even sexually abused, sexually tortured, during, in marriages also. So it has been brought very, very strongly. And then this has been a discussion at the table for a long time. And then this marital rape has been even in our third report of alternative report of CEDAW. And maybe like I will tell Henry to give that link to you. Marital rape was discussed, and then there were a lot of discussion on that has occurred. People are wondering, why the women's movement is talking about that. Women only know what are the abuses they go through. So it has been talked much, and then we have written quite, we talked about in large about this, and then even to the Justice Verma Committee, marital rape, should be made as a law, has been articulated. So I think that slowly women have talked about what has been happening in their personal life to very dear to them, but talked openly, and they said that they need justice. Women cannot be raped in marriage relationship. I think this is what this announcement. So we've been asking for law recognition. I think government and the law faculties and have recognized this, but very, very much strongly we need to push this issue and get a law for this.
Thank you, Ruth ma'am. Just one last, because there are a lot of people asking, so I can only select the most relevant and you. How is sex work defined as women's right to work? So this is a person who asked from Madhya Pradesh.
Mm-hmm.
How is sex work defined as women's right to work?
Actually, I would go back to the alternate report that we have written. Sex work as work. Some of the on this point the whole world is divided whether sex work need to be treated as work, or sex work need to be stopped. I mean, there is a global discussion on this, but I think that women themselves have organized, sex workers themselves have organized themselves in many of the major cities, and many rural women anyway migrated to cities in order to take sex work. See, sex work is kind of an offering given to women. Their bodies are given to women, given to men, or given to women. So for the enjoyment of sexual relationships. In a sense, sex work, we did not kind of have a very, very comprehensive definition about that. But women who really contribute or sell their sex for labor, I think that is called the sex work. So even that, there is a long way We have come a long way that the sex workers talks about their right. They talked about their rights to payment. They talked about their rights to rest. They talked about the rights to, rights to health care and children's education, many other things, housing. So sex work is not only related now to sexual work alone, but it has been expanded and comprehended in a much bigger way. So there is a lot of improvement and discussions, and then progressiveness. Very good articulating groups have come up to really articulate and say, offering sex is a work and it has to be considered as labor. Therefore, labor rights are also applied to them. So I think these are some of the discussions which are coming up, and for this, I think we need to have a different, sessions altogether. I finished in time.
You have finished on time, Ruth, as always.
Really?
That is, yes, you have.
Okay,
I want to thank Ruth, but before that, Ruth leads the National Alliance of Women's Organizations, formed in the year 1995. And you will come to know more about CEDA in the days to come. And they offer every 5 years their alternative report to CEDA. Imagine one organization bringing together all women in the country consistently and ensuring 3 alternative reports under the leadership of this strong, powerful woman. I will ensure that I have, but I will ask for the links of all the 3 alternative reports, my dear Ruth, so that we pass it on to them. There are many people here who teach women's rights, and they need to look at this alternative reports to be able to broaden their perspective. Number 2, I want to, I remember the days, Ruth, when we both were together in Vienna, standing in that long serpentine queue to register in those days of the beginning of the computer. We were there for 8 hours standing with our suitcases. Vienna was the place, friends, where Ruth, together with other delegates from India, Gerard, get me right, Gerard, invited Manmohan Singh, Gerard him around and told him it is time India ratifies the CEDA. Friends, it was after that that India ratified CEDA in October 1993. Women's rights are an ongoing struggle, she said. Yes, it is an ongoing struggle. And you would have seen that it was after the Nirbhaya incident and the struggles of young people like many of you on the streets of Delhi and the other cities that we were able to win many rights, many women's rights, many new offenses and clarifications on offenses. That was the result of the Justice Verma report. And let me remind you once again, the women were united together. All women's movements threw their differences away and spoke in one voice on women's rights before Justice Verma. Unfortunately, we don't have Justice Verma today when we are so proud of what came out of his report. An 800-page report. We will make sure that don't get scared by the report. Read the titles. Read the titles and then go to chapters that are interesting to you. Women's rights and human rights is captured in all those 800 pages that he compiled in a matter of 3 months. Thank you, Ruth. We all wish you, Ruth, on this very special day after your 41st wedding anniversary yesterday. Ruth is happily married to Sami, another labor activist who works with the unorganized labor across the country. Amazing family. We are proud of you. We are proud of Sami, and all the 200 participants gathered today wish you belatedly by one day a very, very happy wedding anniversary, and hope that you will definitely make it soon to the parliament of this country, which is all we need voices like yours in the parliament today. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Henry. I just wanted to say one last line. I think it's very necessary that respect for women's rights and fundamental freedoms requires that the state put in place mechanisms for redress and accountability through law and policy measures. They, instead of doing that, instead of protecting and promoting women's human rights, there are many women human rights defenders are suffering because they've taken this movement forward. They've been with the struggles of Dalits. They've been with the struggles of, with the struggles of tribal people. Many women are, are in jails today. We are very, unhappy about that. So we must, the movement must build continuously with collective action, and all the new, students must show interest in joining in the movement, and find common ground in order to advocate women's rights in an effective manner. We all have begun. We must really strengthen it, move forward. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you very much. I warmly now welcome my other sister on the panel. She needs to be unmuted. Enakshi Ganguly. Madam Enakshi Ganguly's bio is already circulated, but I need to tell you, this is the next fire on child rights, but not only on child rights, a wholesome aspect of rights, always related, of course, to children. Started her career in 1985 in the Indian Social Institute, went on to a number of organizations and MARG, and from MARG established Huck Center for Child Rights, and today is now an independent consultant and advisor, but co-convenes the working group on human rights in India and the UN that many of us belong to. We are very happy, Enakshi, that you are with us. Let us see a firebrand who tells us why child rights are human rights, associated with the campaign against child labor, campaign against child trafficking, lectures in various universities on courses, not half an hour, courses on child rights, is now reduced by me for 30 minutes on child rights are human rights. Thank you, Enakshi, for accepting our invitation. Floor is yours.
I'm trying to share the screen, so bear with me. Have I been able to do that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So good morning. My name is Enakshi Ganguly, as Henry has said, and I welcome you to what I think is a 21-day challenge on human rights. I hope that at the end of 21 days, this ocean of human rights will have opened up to you, and you would have been able to at least pick from it the reason why human rights as a perspective must be available to all of us wherever we are. And I often say this, that we don't all have to be activists like Ruth or me or Henry. We can be activists wherever we are, because if we have justice in our eyes and justice in our thought, we will bring justice in every walk of our lives. And that's where I would like to begin. It's tragic that we have to call it children's rights are human rights, because I think every human being at whatever age is born with human rights. And it's tragic that we continue to believe in discrimination, intolerance, and othering, as Ruth has mentioned. The reason the children's rights, discussing children's rights, is as much of a challenge as your 21-day challenge, is because unlike Ruth, who speaks for herself, I speak on behalf of a whole group of citizens. And that's what the difference is. When you speak for yourself as to who you are based on your gender identity, you are advocating for yourself. Unfortunately, the world over, except for some, unless you're talking about Greta Thunberg and people like younger people who are actually speaking for themselves, most children are unable to speak for themselves. So they need you and me to speak on their behalf. But to understand why we should speak on their behalf, we need to also understand the concept of childhood. Because when we close our eyes and we look at children, and I would urge you to close your eyes for like a minute. There you go. Close your eyes wherever you are and imagine what a child looks like. It wouldn't be a minute, a second. And you will see that what you see in your mind's eye as a child is a very sweet, cute, cuddly little baby, or an infant, maybe 3 years, 5 years, 6 years. And your imagination may just go up to at the most 10 or 12 years. And that's where the challenge lies, that children are actually much older. Children are all persons up to the age of 18 years, as defined by not internationally, but also nationally. And we keep tending to forget that. And 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old children are not as pretty and lovable always, because they have minds of their own, they have thoughts of their own, and they challenge us every day. And that is why, while Henry mentioned the Nirbhaya case being the watershed in many ways for women's rights, it is also the watershed in many ways for children's rights, because I think the whole country suddenly woke up to children and juvenile offense after the Nirbhaya case. And so while it was progressive, uh, the, the, the debate suddenly became um, a binary between women's rights and children's rights, which it should not be. In fact, women have to be protective, and children will have to be protected. And there should be no dichotomy between the two. And I'm sure a lot of you have these questions about the Juvenile Justice Act, and I do not know if someone is going to be doing it later in the 21 days that you have, because it is a law that you need to understand and not go back with misconceptions of. And the misconceptions were perpetrated through the shrill campaigns and the baying for blood and the penal provisions that were asked for and called for, and in fact made available in the law after the Nirbhaya case. So I will go back, I will retract, and we will talk a little bit about what is childhood. And I wanted to tell you that for many years, before in the Victoria, the concept of childhood, both in India and globally, has changed over the years, and it has developed by societal perceptions, but it has also developed according to a study of brain science. So it is steeped in uh, psychology, social perception, social norms, but it is also steeped in science. It's science that has defined. If you ask why is it 18 years today, it is because science has talked about brain science, has talked about brain development, and found that the human brain develops up to the age of about 20 or 25, and the frontal cortex of the brain, which is here somewhere, which is the one that triggers instinctive reaction, is the one that developed for a very long time. And then so people then came to a sort of an understanding that maybe 2025 is too much, 15 16 is too little, 18 somewhere is towards the closing of the teenage, and that's where they came to to arrived at an age of 18 years. So it may sound arbitrary, because one day before 18 and one day after 18, but somehow law has to have some cutoffs, and therefore 18 years was what was decided in terms of what legal rights for this set of human beings should be. Um, so I would urge you to go back, and this book by Philip Aries is available on the internet. I will not go through it too much because we don't have that kind of a time, but he really was the first person who looked at childhood as a concept and tried to make it open and see when and how did it change. And he felt that he finds that when he looks at history, that it's only in the 17th century that children as a distinct group, as started to be understood and recognized in the world. but the concept of childhood, according to him, is distinct from feelings for children. It's not nothing to do with how I feel for my child. For me, my 28-year-old son or my 32-year-old daughter will be my baby always, and I will keep saying, oh, oh, oh. So, and also the concept of childhood, if you notice, is also changes according to where you stand in your economic activity. So, in a poor family, a 7-year-old who's earning is seen to be an earning hand, and therefore, but for me, and it's okay for them because that's where they come from. So, or a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old, and whereas for many middle class people, their child never grows up. So how we feel about children is not what defines childhood. So I'm the the modern notion of childhood I would say you should read up people who you would think are only philosophers, but they have something to say about children. So go back to Rousseau, go back to Locke, and you will see that the modern concept of childhood and why we need to focus on children came from them. Um, educate in the suddenly in the Victorian period in in UK, post industrialized during the period of industrialization. Before that, if you notice, if you go back to the paintings and drawings, all children were seen to be little mini adults. So they were dressed up as adults in their photographs. Even in India, they wore the same wahi dhoti, wahi kurta. Suddenly, they were just a smaller version of the adults, and they took on the adult roles very, very quickly. But what changed, and that is why we are pushing for right to education so much in this country, is that what changed the perception of childhood and what changed the rights of enabled the rights of children was entry into the education system. So when the longer the children stayed in the education system, the age of the child started to change. And this happened when children in the Victorian period started to go to school, and we found that many more children, uh, the length of childhood started to change. But as I said, poor children lose their childhood much faster, and that remains a reality even today. So if we were look at different stages of childhood, there is infant, there's a child, there are different terms that we keep using. The child, when we say child, we actually in law now mean all persons up to the age of 18. But within that, we will find that there are different terminologies being used, like infant. Like when we say infant mortality rate, we're talking about a certain age group. We often talk about minors, and we say a minor cannot sign a contract, for example. Then we talk about a terminology called adolescence, and which is now, with a lot of programming that you find across the world, you'll find it is about adolescent girls, adolescent boys, period of adolescence. And this period of adolescence is, if you go on, if you look at it from on the net and start looking at the age, you'll find that some people define it from 10, some people define it from 8, some people define it up to 18, some people define it up to 19. But clearly, what they're talking about is a period of biological changes taking place in the life of a child, and therefore needing specific attention. And it is largely to do with the mental and reproductive changes that you see, the onset of sexuality, and how do you address these issues. Um, then, of course, there is the word juvenile, which became so popular after the Nirbhaya, and everybody became a juvenile justice expert. Suddenly, every lawyer who'd never seen a juvenile in their life had become a juvenile justice expert, and were pontificating, including Mr. Subramaniam Swamy was suddenly an expert on juvenile justice when he went to the Supreme Court of India. So, but juvenile is actually not, doesn't automatically mean an offender. Juvenile comes from the Latin word juvenis, which means child. So this word was adopted when the law on juvenile justice was being developed, post the industrial revolution, and when many, and so therefore but over the years it's come to become synonymous with offenders. And so if you go for a police training, you will find that they don't even complete it, though they don't even say juvenile offender or juvenile delinquent. They will say juvenile, and they will expect you to understand that they mean an offender. The other word that you often use is youth and young adult. Young adult is a very modern concept that is often being used. So these are the different words and in the vocabulary on child rights that we often see. I think somebody is waiting to enter, and I am yes. Please take it away from my screen because I cannot read otherwise. Like I said, the modern attitude to children started in the 19th century when the big Victorian middle and upper class emphasized the role of the family and the sanctity of the child. And this has been an attitude that has remained in the Western society, dominated in the Western society. But the uniformity in defining the end of childhood came in with the adoption of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989, which I'm sure if I go into that, it will be a whole new session, and I'll have eaten into my time. But do go on to the internet, look at UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and there is enough literature available that you will find. I'm not going to what about rights and entitlements, needs. I'm sure you will be it will be covered in your overall human rights concepts. But even when we're talking about children, I want to emphasize that a child is a citizen the minute he or she or they or whatever gender they choose to adopt later in their life is born. And therefore, they become a right holder the day they are born, and the state becomes a duty bearer, just like with any other human rights concept that you will be studying. And therefore, government has the obligation towards the realization of the rights of citizens as young as a 1 month or a 1 day old or a few hours old child. And therefore, when we're talking of COVID and we're saying that, the children are, there is suddenly, I think you need to look at, even with COVID, you have to look at it as see how children, what impact it is having on children. We automatically assume in any emergency that if we reach the family, we will reach the child. But it is not true. When we address a family, we often don't reach the women, and we often don't reach the children. And therefore, the need for specific lenses for while you have a social security, when we're talking about social security backups, we also need to be talking about specific rights for women and children. Otherwise, they fall out of the security net, protection nets. I'm coming here. Oh, sorry. I'm okay. To begin with, when we talked about children, there was the whole concept was that of one of welfare, because you opened orphanages, or you fed the child, you looked after the child. It was not seen as a child. The child was not seen as a right holder. The young child was never seen as a right holder. They were seen as as a person that needed to be attended to. But over the years, like all human rights approach, we have moved, even with children, from a needs or welfare-based approach to a rights-based approach. And that's what you see in terms of the way the laws and the policies across the world are being developed. So children and their rights, they are right holders. They are entitled to support as right holders because, as I said before, unfortunately, they depend on us to realize their rights, and they cannot speak for themselves unless we provide them the safe space to do so. If you look at what has happened to children who have participated in the CAA protests, you will know that they do not actually have a safe space. In Bidar, there were sedition cases filed against 7-year-olds. In UP, there were children who were picked up, put in lockups, and beaten up brutally. And you will find those reports on the Huck website, and you need to look at those to understand. And in your mind's eye, when you say, oh my God, these 17, 18-year-olds are actually such violent children, what were they doing in the CAA protest? You need to go back, read, and see that they have as much a right to protest sometimes as we all do. And it is the responsibility of the state to provide them with a space where they can hear their voices. So that is what I meant by support of the rights holder. The state and its government are therefore obligated to realize its right. Adults can play a role in achieving children's rights, but the state remains the primary duty holder. All rights are common for adults and children. Some rights are defined specifically for children, both in the Constitution as well as the UNCRC. And the Constitution came way before the UNCRC and was extremely progressive when it looked at the rights of children. But unfortunately, some of those rights were in the directive principles. The right to education has been turned into a constitution, into a fundamental right. We need to still look at other rights that remain in the directive principles. Some children need special attention because of their situation, because of their disability, because they belong to certain religious groups, because they belong to certain ethnic groups, just like with any other human rights. So the history of human rights is important, but I'm not going to go very, very deeply into it. But I would say that although child labor was very common, I mean, child labor is common in India and South Asia even today, but child labor was also common to the US and the UK and Europe. And through the Industrial Revolution, children were working very, very hard. Very young children were working. But and if you read Charles Dickens and all those novels from those periods, you would know how hard their lives were. But something changed there. And if they could change, and the reason I bring this in is if they could change in those very hard times, it is important to understand and recognize and believe that we in India can change too. We keep making excuses about poverty. We keep making excuses about our culture. We make hundreds, and we have every excuse to even employ a domestic labor as a child in our homes, because we say if we don't keep him here or keep her here, she will not be safe, and they will never get food. So it's better to be with us than to be hungry. But if you notice that this was the situation then in Europe and America, if they could change it, we can too. And that is the reason I have brought this in. In 19th century Great Britain, 1/3 of poor families were without a breadwinner as a result of death or abandonment, obliging many children to work from a very young age. In England and Scotland, 2/3 of the workers in the 143 power cotton mills were children. So they were working in mines, they were working in chimney sweeps, they were working in cottage industries, they were working in farming, they were everywhere, just like we see in India. And this is a picture that I brought so that you can see this is how they looked. And how are they any different from the look that we have of our children? Yes, they were in coats because it's very cold there, but beyond that, this is how the working child in India looks today, even now. So therefore, I wanted to say that we can change, and then that's when they brought in the laws, and many of the laws that we have in India from the 1920s onwards are a reflection of the changes that were taking place in the laws in the UK, because at that time we were under the colonial law. And so those colonial laws, or like the Apprentice Act, etc., were brought in to address these children who were vagrant, truant, or begging, or orphaned, or children who, because we must understand that if we put adult responsibilities on children, then we must also expect them to behave like adults in some ways and not know the reason for it, but they just emulate those adults. And so they do the same crimes that children do, that adults do. And so then you do have children who offend. And in those days, they started to put children in jails, just like we were demanding in India. And then they recognized that you cannot put children in jails. And if you put children in jails, then it takes away life and an opportunity to reform. And that's when they set in place a separate system for children. And they recognized it in as far back as in the 1920s. And yet in 2015 and 16, we were once again debating this whole issue. The history of the UNCRC is important. It goes back to the First World War. And remember this lady, Eglantine Jebb. She was the founder of what is also known to all of you today as the Save the Children. She was the founder of Save the Children, and she was a British teacher. And she was responsible for having the rights of children adopted in the League of Nations. I'm not going to read exactly what it was, but it was a 7-point statement, and it was adopted in the League of Nations, and that led to to a declaration on child rights, which then became got adopted further and further and became a UN declaration. So this is a sort of a timeline. Into 1923, Eglantine Jebb developed the international declaration, first ever declaration on child rights. 1924, it was adopted by the League of Nations. 1948, it was adopted as part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which you have been introduced to. There were many, but many continued to argue that there was a need for a separate document for children, just like there was for women and for indigenous people later. And so in 1959, the second declaration on the rights of the child was adopted based on the experiences of the World War II. And in 1979, when I still remember this because I was in school, an International Year of the Child was declared, and a 10-point declaration was highly publicized. In 1989, we finally got the UNCRC. And then 1990, there was a World Summit on Children. 2000, we adopted optional protocols. And I'm sure as part of your course, you will be told what the difference between what an optional protocol is, what a general comment is, and how those are very important. And then you can go back and look at, there are about 22 general comments. If I'm not mistaken, maybe every day there's one new one coming out. On the UNCRC, there are 3 optional protocols. India has ratified 2 of them. They were adopted in 2000, and in May 2002, the World Fit for Children document was adopted, and the latest optional protocol was in 2011, which is about communication of complaint, direct communication and complaints procedure, which India has not adopted. So, but this is what should guide us, not just because UNCRC tells us to. And I often get very worried because if I ask people when I'm teaching them or talking to them or training them or just having a conversation, I ask them what is the rights of children, and they come out with right to development, right to survival, right to protection, right to participation, and there are 4 rights. But I think it's important if these are 4 rights that have been bundled together for popular consumption in the UNCRC. No, the practitioners have bundled the UNCRC rights, which is so long and so many articles, into these 4 bundles. But it is important to open each one of them up and understand them. But what should be guiding us in whatever we do, wherever we are, is this 3 concepts: best interest of the child, non-discrimination, and participation. And I heard Akila talk about best interest yesterday, so I will not go into it. Non-discrimination is a human rights concept that's going to be running through your course throughout. And participation is about the right to be heard. And this is contentious because we are talking about children, and we say, what do you mean? Children don't know what they're talking about. But yesterday, I remember Akila also mentioning this, that children do know what they want, and it depends. And therefore, we need to understand that this right to participation is linked with the concept of evolving capacities. So the capacity at 8 years old is going to be different at 10, will be different at 16, and will be different at 18. And if we recognize that there are evolving capacities, we will provide, we will understand their right to be heard and their participation in this context, and provide them the necessary support. I can see that Henry is already there, and he's telling me. So in India, I will just quickly go back. If India, the rights of the child came in largely with the reform movement, and it was first recognized, actually, if I were to go back, it was first ever recognized when a young girl called Fulmani Devi, who was 11 years old and was married to a very old man, died of bleeding because she had been marital. She was a victim of marital rape. Nobody talked about that at that time. She was a married girl, and therefore a man had the right to have sex with her, but she died. And then strangely enough, it was a doctor who brought it up and filed a petition and took it to the British colonial rule and said that we need to have a law on child marriage, and then slowly about widow remarriage. And so that's how we have had the concept of childhood develop in India, and it's available where I'm in my PPT, which I'm sure she will be shared with you, and you will know of. But please remember these names: Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Dayanand Saraswati. Remember these names, Keshav Chandra Sen. They were very important. They played a very, very important role in our recognition of the Indian child as a child. A lot of, I'm not going to go through these. India has ratified all of. So what important to understand that when we talk about children, all laws apply to children, but those that are specific to children are also there, which we need to know about. Similarly, all international conventions refer to children, and so do the ones that are specific to children. There are 3 reports that have been submitted, just like in CEDAW, to the UNCRC committee. They are available on the internet. Please look at them. It's important to understand that children's rights have also been included in the Universal Periodic Review that Henry has been coordinating also. And there have been very specific recommendations made by states to India, some of which have been adopted and some of which have not been adopted. I would like to end by saying that when you look at laws for children, punitive laws don't work. So either we look at them as perpetrators of horrendous crimes, or we are looking at them as some very innocent people who need to be protected. And therefore, 2 important detrimental things that have happened in law in India has been: one is the introduction of the death penalty in the law on child sexual abuse, as a result of which we are already witnessing fall in reporting, because you must understand that 70% of the rapes or the sexual abuse that children face is inside the home by known people. And this is data, statistics. And therefore, children want the abuse to stop. They want sexual abuse to stop, but they do not want the people that they know to be dead. They don't want them to be hanged. So they stop reporting. So or they turn, and then we say, oh my God, this adolescent girl, she actually must have asked for it because she turned hostile. But we need to understand why they turn hostile, boys and girls. The second detrimental thing that by popular in support for children in our own way, we thought we were supporting children, and we were supporting, actually supporting women. was the change that we wanted in the juvenile, that the country wanted, not we, but the country wanted in the juvenile justice law, in which they wanted young people to be treated as adults. And they said if they're mature enough to commit a crime, they should be treated as adults. And which meant that now we have an introduction into the juvenile justice law of a provision that allows for 16 to 18 years old to be treated as adults for certain serious crimes that are over, which have punishments over 7 years. But of course, because there was such a big hue and cry from child rights activists and human rights activists and the court twice told them not to change the law. Salil Bali versus Union of India, Subramaniam Swamy versus Union of India, two different chief justices went of the Supreme Court of India said, do not change the law, implement the law in the spirit it is meant to be and see if it works. But no, the government of India gave in to popular perception of all the hue and changed the law, and as a result of which we have this. But because we made such a lot of noise, what it introduced was that one, that there will be a preliminary assessment, which is again a very very funny thing, because the concept of law is innocent unless proved. And here the child goes into the system, his or her mental assessment is done, and it is assumed that the crime has been committed, and the child is decided whether he or she will go into the adult system or the child system, whether it will be the juvenile system or the adult system. And therefore, following that, I hope that the juvenile justice law will be taught to you. It's a complicated law. It's a very long law. It includes adoption. It includes all kinds of things. So please look at it. But it's an interesting law because we follow the welfareist approach. It takes into account its Care and Protection of Children Act. So it is about children who need care and protection, who are neglected, and it is also about juvenile offenders. There are SDGs on children that you need to look at. I'm not going to go into the plethora of laws, but I'm going to leave you with this. This is how complicated it is to look at children and laws, because there are just so much that you need to know and understand and look at. And if you don't do that, we will not be doing justice to children. But I leave you with what I believe is for me the most important thought, that children are like a dipstick. Their condition tells you what the condition of society is. So if you're looking at the way the migrants are walking, look at the condition of children in that big group, and you will know what the situation of the migrants is. Go into any place and you'll know that the most hungry, the most deprived, if it is the child, then the whole society is deprived. And that is what Nelson Mandela reminded us when he said that a state is known by the way it treats its children. A nation is known by the way it treats its children. So I wait for questions now.
Thank you, Enakshi. There are many, many, many questions, and time does not allow us to go into all of them. Just very specific, relevant 2 to 3 questions. First is, are there or should there be different sets of rules or laws when a guardian violates child rights of an infant, or when child rights are violated by an outsider?
Okay.
Second question I would like to pose here is with regard to the birth registration, since it does not happen in so many instances, and because of it, a child is unable to access provisions of the state. Does it amount to violation of child rights? And third, the last one, and specific to this lockdown, because they are hearing challenges of various communities all across, they have not heard with regard to children. So under this lockdown, what are your concerns with respect to rights of children?
Thank you. Very important. No, I don't think guardians should have privilege over outsiders. In fact, if it is the guardians who are people who are supposed to protect children who are being violating the rights, how can they get more privilege over anybody else? And I think, and I know that the law does not make any distinction like that. But what you do need to understand is that if you have very, very penal provisions, um, it's a very peculiar thing. Children, if say a father is the abuser, the child also loves the father. It is very difficult for people to understand this. But if you understand psychology, you will understand. If you watched Highway, the film Highway in Hindi, you will understand what a Stockholm syndrome is. It is a very real thing, that I love my abuser because he is related or she is related to me, but I also hate my abuser for what he or she is doing to me. So this is when we understand this, then we will understand the relationship between the abuser and the abused. And it can happen to women, but it happens very much more to children, because the relationship is one of not just of power, but it's also biological relationship. But should they be given the privilege over them? I don't think so. What you do need to do is to have safe spaces for children to speak up. What you do need to do is to empower other members of the family to look after and create a safety net for children, for the abused or the violated child. But I wasn't able to say it in the limited time that I have. But like all human rights, children's rights are divided into economic, cultural, and social rights, and civil and political rights. The civil and birth registration of children is a civil and political right. It's the most basic and the most important civil and political right. And we in India, because we are so low in birth registration, we are actually violating children's rights. We are Because what we are doing is, by not registering them when they are born, we are denying them of a series of rights that comes with this right, including if they offend, and then they go before the juvenile justice board. Then it becomes a huge issue of trying to prove the age, and the child spends the whole time on adults trying to determine whether the child was an adult or a child. When something happened, it happens with child marriage, it happens with child sexual abuse, it happens with, so all that, so much of the litigation that we do is around proving age. And if we had birth registration that was universal, this would not be happening. What are the challenges in COVID? I think there is a lot. It's not true that it is not being written. There's a lot being written globally. And if you go on the internet, you will find that there is a lot of literature being generated on COVID, the lockdown, the lack of resources, hunger, and the impact on children. There is a lot there has been an exponential number of calls that Childline has received. And not all of them are about abuse. A lot of them is about just calls for hunger, like give us food. Then of course, when you are in a confined space, and when you getting at each other and there's nervous energy, often people turn violent, and the violence first falls on children. It may not just be sexual violence, it could just be a physical violence. It could be just beating, it could be corporal punishment. A lot of, what I am seeing, and I think it's something that all of us need to be very cognizant of. We had almost received I don't know whether the quality of education had not improved exponentially, but we had gone to about 101% of gross enrollment in our schools. The net enrollment was less, but there has been an improvement in the number of children who've been going to school. Suddenly, now with COVID, children are no longer going to school. A lot of them are having to do their classes like you and I are doing now. Now, if you don't have an internet connection, you don't have a phone, you are in a place where there can be no internet connection, there is automatically going to be dropout. So, COVID and internet and online classes is going to increase the number of dropouts of children from the education system. Secondly, all these people who are going back into their villages, many of them were children who were studying in wherever they were in the cities. Now, what will happen to them when they go back to their villages? Will the village school, will they be able to adjust in a village school having studied in a school here? They may not, and they'll say, people, young people develop attitudes, whatever. And also the economy of, you must read Sainath's article in the first post day before yesterday. He has explained how the economy, after all these people left there where they were because the economy could not absorb them. Now they are going back into that same economy. Will the economy be able to absorb them? And if they can't, then what happens to children? So child labor might increase, child trafficking might increase, because as vulnerability increases. So just at the moment, we're just seeing it all unfolding, but we need to be cognizant, keep our eyes open, and see what best we can do.
Thank you, Enakshi. I should apologize for abrupting like this, because at 10:30 some of our participants are moving on to another course, and that is why we want to respect them. We thank you wholeheartedly for what you've done. I'm sure I'll have your approval for this. Therefore, participants, all questions that were asked which are not answered in these coming sessions, including today's, will be passed on to the speakers. The speakers will answer them, will be requested to answer them on WhatsApp, orally, voice recording, and the voice recording will be shared with all of you. So if you don't get an answer to your questions here, you will get it. If you had raised it, you will get it afterwards, subsequently. You trust me, we keep up to our words, it will be done.
Please download this book. This will give you the latest on children's rights in India.
I'm coming to that. I'm coming to you. Friends, today, please, after the session is over, go to the website of HUC, Center for Child Rights. I'm not advertising for HUC. I'm advertising for one of the best child rights organizations in this country. Academicians teaching rights, lecturers teaching rights. You cannot carry on teaching child rights without visiting this website. I know you will get angry with me for pointing it out to you, but you are teachers to whom I need to point out things. You have a whole chapter on child rights there, a section on child rights, which talks to you about what the Constitution says, what are the Indian laws and policies, what are the international laws, and HUC's contribution to the international mechanisms. Please visit it. There's tons to learn. Her 30 minutes here is to induce us to that. Look at the plans for children, the policies for children that have been treated out there. There were references made today, both in the morning session and now, on UN treaties, on UN covenants, on optional protocol, on general comments. Don't worry, all this will be handled in Module 3. Module 3 will handle this meticulously. Don't worry. This evening at 5:30, there is a panel, a very prestigious panel on death penalty. Please, the information will be shared with you. Immediately after your meetings are over, rush to that if you want further clarification on death penalty. I think we have covered everything here that I wanted to cover. Good. One more. Internships. Many of you are professors. Send your interns to an organization like HUC. Don't start crying and saying, I'm from Tamil Nadu. Lady Doe College had sent one of its students for internship to HUC. Oh, 3 students, internship to HUC. One of them is working in HUC today. All these things happen. I learned my human rights, my passion for human rights in my college through my teachers in the classroom. Therefore, we always point out various opportunities to you. send students to such organizations for internship. Send computer students. I have received computer students from North India to my organizations as interns, and they've gone knowing how much they can contribute to human rights through their computer knowledge. So use these organizations, use Ruth Manorama, use Enakshi Ganguly as mentors of our students, of our young people. Thank you. We have overstepped today. Thank you very much for your patience. There are still 184 of you still remaining. Thank you. Afternoon, we will have Kavita Srivastava and Professor Dr. Deepak Nathan. Thank you very much. Enakshi, thank you very much. Very difficult for me to ask you to speak in 30 minutes, but you did a wonderful job. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.